Me and Claude are like besties.
Okay, welcome back to the Marketing Playbook presented by Forder and Details Interactive. Here you'll take away 3 game-winning marketing plays every episode to take back to your team. I'm your host, Mark Friedman, and my career has been focused on direct-to-consumer marketing, direct mail, physical retail, and digital commerce. This is episode number 148, and today's guest is Angela Clark, founder of Eclipse Advisory Group. What does a career look like when you follow curiosity more than convention? Angela started as a buyer at Pottery Barn, helped pioneer early commerce at Levi Strauss and eBay, and eventually became VP of Digital at Patagonia, one of the most values-driven, fiercely loyal brands in American retail. Along the way, she managed a D2C business, an activist platform supporting 1,000 grassroots organizations, and the consumer insights function for the entire company. Now she's launched her own advisory practice, helping mid-sized brands and late-stage startups scale profitably in a world that keeps changing faster than most companies can adapt. Today she's going to get into what it's really like to build a digital business inside a wholesale-first company, why storytelling is the most underrated tool in a marketer's arsenal, and what most brands get wrong when they roll out new technology. Before we get started, a quick thank you as always to Max Brandstetter of the Wild Business Growth Podcast for producing this episode. You can reach him at max@maxpodcasting.com to help bring your podcast to life. Let's open the playbook. Ready, break. Welcome to the Marketing Playbook Podcast, and today we have one of those guests who reminds you just how far a career can travel when you lead with curiosity and a genuine obsession with the customer. Angela Clark has spent her career building digital and commerce businesses at some of the most iconic brands in American retail. She started her career as a buyer at Pottery Barn, helped pioneer early e-commerce at companies like Levi Strauss and eBay, and eventually rose to become VP of Digital at Patagonia, a brand famous not just for its products, but for its values-driven approach to business and activism. Over 4 years there, she oversaw everything from Patagonia.com to their ActionWorks platform, weaving together commerce, storytelling, and social impact into a single digital experience. Beyond the day-to-day, Angela has been an outspoken voice for women in leadership. She sits on boards including Ergo Baby and the California State Parks Foundation, is a member of Extraordinary Women on Boards, and recently launched her own advisory practice, Eclipse Advisory Group. Angela, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, it's finally nice to meet you. I feel like we've been chatting a long time, certainly during your time at Patagonia, so appreciate you joining. Just like we do at the beginning of all of these shows, we like to get the guest's first story, where you grew up, what your upbringing was like, and was there anything during that time that might have suggested that you would have had the career in the areas that you've spent time in? We'd love to hear that story.
Yeah, so I grew up in Michigan and suburban Detroit, pretty typical upbringing, me and my parents and my little brother. I went to Eastern Michigan. I studied finance there, thinking I would be an investment banker. Baby of the 80s, that was the thing to do, and thought I'd, take the creative stuff and do that after I make all the money. And I did not want to go to grad school. So I ended up in merchandising. But I think career wise, the thing I reflect on, honestly, one of the biggest impacts in my life was going to an all girls high school. And I would say what I learned in that experience was there were no gender norms because it was just all girls. And so the smartest student was a girl, the best athlete in school was a girl. And I think when I went to college, that norm, I started to see how dynamic and how women operated when they were in a group with men and women, and them sort of being a little bit more quiet or not taking the lead or not being recognized for their accomplishments. And as I think about that now, I think that's what has sent me to being so passionate about making sure that women find their voice in their careers and any other place in life. So I think that's a big part of it. My parents were really big on education. They met in college. So, probably at 5 years old, I knew I was going to school. I was going to college. It was just where I was going and what I was going to do.
That's great. And it's so interesting, how you talk about the women in leadership and women getting their voice. And it is something that is a common thread throughout your career and the things that you've done and the things you still do today. So before we hit, the companies that you've been in, maybe, talk briefly about what you're doing today to help women keep their voice.
Yeah, so I'm in a few organizations. I post a lot on LinkedIn, and I'd say probably half of my content is around this topic. And maybe not just for women, but for anybody who's going through their career, going through those moments of just like that gut check of like, is it just me or is there something really happening here? Like, when is it you? When is it the environment? When do you need to kind of understand that you've given it all that you can give, and maybe there's a different path for you, and that pivot's okay? And just giving people, I find that in my career, whenever I've been in a leadership role and had other cross-functional peers, the thing that keeps coming back is, they say to me like, "Wow, you really, you were fearless about standing up for yourself. You said that thing in the meeting that everyone was thinking, but nobody else was willing to say." And I never really saw it as courage. I think it was just battle wounds of like, just getting to the point where I was just tired of being, behind the scenes or slightly impatient maybe of just like, okay, let's just get this done. Like I know that I'm as smart as anyone else here. I'm sure I could figure it out. I might not always know the answer, but I got a little more fearless about just being able to find my voice. And honestly, I think my mom was a big part of that as well. She's a very outspoken woman as well. So I learned that from her. And those moments of first half of my career, I was very quiet. I was the invisible, person kind of just getting things done, and it didn't do much for me. So I had to learn to kind of advocate for myself, and I learned that through some other strong women leaders actually as well.
I looked at the arc of your career, and there's not too many people that I interview for this show any longer that actually have catalog experience.
Yes.
And I grew up in the catalog industry. That's really, I was a CPA and did that for a few years and then moved into the catalog world. And so when, I was researching and saw that you spent 4 years at Spiegel,
Yeah.
tell me how you got involved in catalog.
Yeah, so I had my first buying job was at Dayton Hudson's Corporation, went through the merchandising program there. It was not a great experience for me, and I thought I'd never be a buyer again. And I moved to Chicago, and Spiegel was based out of Chicago at the time, and they had a merchandising program there. And so I fell into it. What I loved about it versus my department store experience was I was communicating to the customer through storytelling, through images, through copy, and then you would get feedback. Every time you mailed a catalog, you got to see how many orders you got on each page, and you got to evaluate, what photography worked, what colors worked best. And that really kind of was my right and left brain at work at the same time. I was very analytical, but I was also creative. And so for me, catalog was like that perfect marriage. And so I really kind of fell in love with the role after that. And obviously, everything in catalog is really replicated in digital. It's the same concept, right? So for those of us who have been around a lot long enough to work in the catalog industry, there's a lot of synergy that goes from one to the other.
You've obviously, had a number of digital roles and you had that paper background. Were you able to bring paper into any of the digital businesses that you've been in and find that it was valuable?
Yeah, absolutely. I always had a direct to mail program for acquisition, retention. And I think I really valued that because of my paper experience. And then, package inserts is another way that we would use paper to kind of get people back in or, buyback programs, come back and shop back with a coupon, depending on the brand. So I think all of that was just an extension of what I had learned in catalog. And then, like I said, obviously the analytics piece, we didn't call it analytics then, it was just reporting, but that's really what it was, right? We were looking at sales performance, which colors worked best, which mailing areas worked best. All that data that we had in catalog is now what we use in digital.
As you were talking about analytics and you're saying, we didn't call it analytics, I was starting to think ahead with you. What did we call it? And we probably just called it reporting.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's what it was. It was reams of paper every Monday with all those reports.
After Spiegel, you had a run of some really interesting D2C home brands. Some time at Pottery Barn, Smith and Hawken, which is another brand, I guess was built out of California. I remember that very fondly in my catalog days, and also Red Envelope. So you went from kind of a mass merchandising business in Spiegel now into the home category. Tell me about that transition.
Yeah, so the transition for me, I started in apparel at Spiegel, and then I actually moved to a brand where I was doing home furnishing, product development. And so that was a natural transition into Pottery Barn. At that time, Pottery Barn was growing like gangbusters. That was probably their glory growth days. And that was an amazing experience. One, I was fearful to move to California, which is ironic because now you can't pry me out of the state. But I moved there thinking, I'll try it, but I don't know if it's going to work. And I absolutely loved it. It was probably the first brand I worked for that had a lot of women leaders in it, and was probably more female dominant. And that was a fun experience for me. It was a nice change, a very diverse group coming from the Midwest. I found that people were, just as assertive, just as ambitious, but their approach was a little more laid back. And I think it fit my personality a little bit better. Where I was in the Midwest, I was kind of always getting like, you're either too aggressive or you're too passive. I could never really find that right groove. And then when I moved to California, it seemed to fit my personality a little bit more from a company culture perspective.
It's so interesting. I grew up in New York and have lived here, New York, New Jersey, for my entire life. And, I've always, and I have lots of, work friends in the Midwest and out in California. I always had this perception that as we moved west, things got a lot calmer and a lot slower, and the sense of urgency wasn't quite the same as it was on the East Coast. But, as you get more mature, you realize it's
Yeah.
plenty of sense of urgency all around the country, but it's just different. So that's interesting, about the vertical change. And where was your first opportunity in digital? Was it in the home businesses that you were in?
Yeah, it was actually a Smith& and Hawken. So they, at that time, the catalog would be the lead, and then they wanted the website to mirror the catalog in a way. So that was literally a role that was created at Smith& and Hawken. Raised my hand for that job, and it was a great experience because one, I was, thinking the same thing, pagination, what the homepage would look like, the storytelling on the homepage versus what ended up dropping in your mailbox, and that synergy between the two was something that I kind of brought to that brand, just from my catalog experience. And we was really learning digital as everybody else was at that time. And we were still kind of really learning what this thing is, how people use it and how they engage with it. But you still had, shipping logistics was still a thing. So all that was very transferable into digital. And so, yeah, it was really Smith and Hawken where I really kind of picked that up and really never let it down after that.
This episode is brought to you by Forder, and they've got something worth hearing about. There's a conference coming up in New York on October 14th called Impact, and I'll actually be there. So if you're planning to attend, I'd love to connect in person. It's built for e-commerce leaders navigating AI, agentic commerce, and the very real pressure on margins right now. Practical conversations, senior people, real challenges to solve. If you want to go, and I think you should, there's a promo code that gets e-commerce leaders like you in for free. Just head to forder.com/impact and use the code PLAYBOOK, all lowercase, at checkout. That's forder.com/impact, and the code is PLAYBOOK, PLAYBOOK, all lowercase. Enjoy the conference. You've used the word storytelling a few times already in only 10 minutes of chatting with me. So let's hit storytelling. What does that mean to you? And how do you get the folks around you? You've had some pretty senior leadership roles. How do you get them to understand? How do you bring everybody to understand that storytelling is so important?
I think I a lot of times I talk about it a lot. What I really learned at Pottery Barn, because their catalog was so impactful, that you as the brand have the opportunity to tell the customer what's most important, and you have an opportunity to guide the dialogue and candor of what is happening with their relationship with the brand. Obviously, it's a lot more reciprocal now. We're listening a lot. We had a lot more customer listening. We're getting feedback, and we're sort of coaching and changing that as we go along. But knowing that you have that power and understanding that it's really important. I mean, that's what people respond to most, right? Like people are getting their full jobs now with storytelling in their title now. And I think we're coming to an age where we really understand the obviously the influencer market growing and growing that that's really rooted in storytelling and that's how humans interact. And so I really try to make sure that we have a framework of what we think is relevant to the brand. And then we also have a framework for feedback and customer engagement so we can continue to morph and make sure that the storytelling is really relevant and stays consistent, but also is willing to change. I think sometimes brands get a little stuck in what they think their story is. And sometimes the customer is saying something is totally different. I think we experience that a lot at, Patagonia, where, they have such a strong viewpoint of who they are as a brand. But when you look at the product sales and where people are buying and how people are using the product, there's a different story there. So trying to get to marry the two and deciding when and where to tell those stories, because sometimes you can tell them all. Levi, I learned that quite a bit. The minute we stopped talking about 501, sales went down. And us internally, we're tired of 501. We know what it is. But the customer, they're never tired of it. That's what they know. It's synonymous with the brand. So you could never stop talking about that. But we also had to talk about the skater gene or the commuter gene or all these other things that were fashion things. And then finding the space and the ability to, put that right message in front of the right customer, which we talk about all the time now, personalization. Again, back then we didn't really call it that, right? It was very nuanced communication, but I try really hard to make sure that we're not missing the mark and we're really sort of seeing where customers are giving us signals that there's something they're really interested in here. How can we lean into that and connect it back to what the brand feels most important?
It's so interesting, the way you couch that. There's so many brands, they have their perception of what they are and what they're trying to say, but oftentimes it's not consistent with what the customers view them to be. And, those are the brands that struggle because they're not aligned with the perception of customers. So
Yep,
interesting.
absolutely.
You mentioned Levi Strauss, some time there as a senior manager and director of e-commerce. Interesting when you were involved, still a very, very large wholesale business, and you were
Hmm.
part of D2C. So I had a similar experience working at Steve Madden, which was a wholesale company that had retail and digital. Tell us about what it was like to be the digital person or one of the digital people in a business like that.
Yeah, so I'm sure you can appreciate this that when you have those direct to consumer roles in a brand that's really led by wholesale, direct to consumer is an afterthought in the very beginning. And there were meetings happening or product, and I wasn't even invited. And I'm like, well, how am I supposed to do my business if I don't know what's happening with the assortment and where the brand is going? So you start inviting yourselves into meetings, breaking yourselves into meetings, and over time, you would start to get invited in, and then you would understand the impact of D2C. And I think what a lot of those legacy brands sort of learn is when you're heavily reliant on wholesale, you don't as much control over your brand. One of those wholesale department stores could go out of business tomorrow, and in today's climate, nobody's coming back to replace that brand. So that is just money lost. And so when you have that direct sale to the customer, you control your destiny a little bit more. And that I was at Levi when we went through that transition of realizing we can't be beholden to Macy's. We have to lead our own, vision globally, and then our own connection with the customer so they have a direct relationship. So for me, that meant, trying to have the biggest assortment, having the product exclusives on D2C instead of wholesale. There was a mindset shift that really needed to happen there. And then even just simple things like the calendar, the go-to-market calendar was highly driven by the wholesale calendar. And it doesn't work to D2C. They're done. In November, everything's shipped. Wholesale team is, ready to start having cocktail parties. D2C, you're just getting into it, right? At the end of December, all the way through January, and probably through mid-January and end of season sale. So there's a complete different cycle there. And when the whole company is faced this way, you kind of have to educate people and bring them along that actually we have to do different ways. We have to have multiple paths here. And then eventually it tended to all shift because they realize that, your platform is your biggest store. It's open 24 hours a day. It's the place to have the best expression. The brand's the place where you have the most control. You don't know how you're going to show up on a store, wholesale floor. You can suggest how you're going to show up, but you don't have control of who you're going to be next to. You don't have control of how customers engage with that. You have that control on the operated channels. And so for me, that's the fun part for me as well, because that was probably part of what I didn't love on the other side of being a buyer. And, was that I didn't have a lot of control of what I was actually doing and buying. There was a lot of dictation on how that was operated, but in D2C, you have a lot more control, and that's a lot more fun for me.
Yeah, that's great. Quick Levi story. When I started this podcast in February of 2020, which was great because it gave me something to do during COVID. One of
Right.
my first guests was one of the former CEOs of Levi Strauss, Chip Berg.
Oh, yeah.
He was gracious enough to do the show. We both went to Lafayette College. We happened to be in the same fraternity, and he
Oh,
was,
wow.
yeah, he was a good get for me to start the show.
Yeah, he was absolutely probably one of my favorite CEOs I've worked for because he got it. Like he quickly saw, and everything that he said he was going to do, he did for that brand, which I think is really, really impactful. So that's amazing relationship.
One of the things that you've done in your career is worked on a platform, a replatform of a business, and less interested in how it was for you back then. But you've been in the space for a long time. What are people thinking about as far as replatforming today?
Yeah.
In my experience, it's different. But tell me what you think, and is it different than what it was 10 years ago?
I think it's very different because there are so many tools and so many systems, and the cost of running a digital business continues to climb. So I think a lot of times people are looking at replatforming on, can I find, if you're on something like a Salesforce, and nothing against Salesforce, a lot of big brands are on them, and very expensive enterprise platform. And there are so many tools we're using today that we didn't need, and we're not even talking about the AI tools that are happening now. Like there's the cost of keep staying on the premium platform that costs the most money out there possible, as opposed to maybe changing over to, another platform that might save you half the cost, and then reuse that money for something else like personalization tools, or, those are types of things that people are really having conversations about. Something else that we're talking a lot about in digital is, you might look at your tech stack, and at one point it was great to have a text message provider, a email provider, a push, but have them all be different, and then your C I'm trying to use too many acronyms. Your CDP or your customer data, platform, have those all be different brands. And in some ways that has its benefits because you're not beholden to one company. But a lot of people are rethinking, does it make more sense to bring that all together because we're trying so hard to have a holistic view of the customer at every touch point, that sometimes replatforming all of that onto a single provider can give you leverage and maybe just ease of use. Like my last role, there were some people just like, it's just hard for me to manage a text message provider and an email provider. Like I want to do all this, but I literally have to, they don't play nice, So how do I do that? So I think in those replatform conversations today, it is not only like what's the most cost effective and most powerful, but how do we stay the most connected and most efficient so my team's not spinning their wheels on things, that there are these great promises of, AI and all this. But if the data's in 9 different places and it's messy, as much as a lot of AR partners are saying they can just, slide over the top and pull all the data out and ship it out, I have yet to see it in an impactful way. And I think we're still a little bit of ways from that. So a lot of that tech stack discussion and conversation is really, really critical at this stage because we're still a few years off before we get to there.
You had a role at a company called Elf cosmetics. Interesting change from apparel into beauty. I've said on this show many times that beauty is one of those industries that, at least from my experience, I've found that is the most difficult to break into or to get a job in beauty if you haven't had a job in beauty. They seem to be somewhat insular. At least that was
Yeah.
my experience. Tell me about your move to Elf and this challenge from apparel to beauty.
Yeah. So I actually followed a boss to Elf Cosmetics and a couple other people from Levi. Their headquarters is based in Oakland, so right across the bridge from Levi Strauss. And you're right. I've personally had fandom for a lot of beauty brands, and those are one of those resumes that always got crickets and never heard anything from people.
So it wasn't just me. It wasn't just me.
No, it's
Okay.
really real. And for me, at that point, I have, like you said, I'm at home, I had apparel, I've done product development, all these different roles. And then I came to Elf and I was like, I don't know how to market mascara. I don't like, it's just a completely different animal. And so for me, I did feel a little bit of fish out of water in the beginning. But those basic principles of marketing are applicable pretty much anywhere. What I loved about my experience at Elf was it was probably one of the first digital native brands I had worked for. And talk about connection with the customer and fandom. I really, really think I learned there how powerful it is to have people who just adore and love your brand and how much you can leverage that for growth. So yeah, it was an amazing experience.
The devil is in the details. You probably have heard that phrase time and time again in your professional life. Projects get started with great intentions, but you no longer have the time to pay attention to the little things that could make the difference between success and failure. At Details Interactive, you can discuss your business with a seasoned direct to consumer marketing executive who's helped launch and grow web businesses and integrate multi channel marketing initiatives. Learn more at detailsinteractive.com.
You talk about loving and adoring a brand. Patagonia might be one of those brands that's, loved and adored. And I think when we were chatting a few months ago, I said, geez, if I sit on one more virtual call and see somebody wearing a Patagonia fleece, I'm going to scream. And literally in a week, there must have been 15 people wearing some form of a vest or a fleece that had the Patagonia label. So it's out there. It's a really well-known brand. What was your role at Patagonia?
Yeah, so my role was head of digital, which was probably a little understated on what I actually did in my role. So I was in charge of the D2C .com for Patagonia. So that's acquisition, retention, site experience, anything customer facing and engaging customer, I was responsible for, including product development. I also had Patagonia Action Works, which was another URL for their non-for-profits. That entity would support 1,000 grassroots organizations every year, helping them raise money, helping support their causes, and upskilling them so that they can fight for climate change in whatever aspect and avenue they were doing. And that's a North America-based role. And then I also had consumer insights and analytics, and that was for the entire organization. So since we sort of had the most data from a marketing perspective, we were the ones that kind of farmed that out through the rest of the organization. So those were probably the three biggest pillars of my role. I had 7 departments overall. It was a pretty big leap from True Religion. I'm not gonna lie. It was definitely the first year was straight uphill. But yeah, it was like you said, it was three totally different divisions. So it was a fun experience there too.
In a business, like that is so well known, is it easier to acquire customers in a brand that people know? You mean, you always need to do brand awareness. You kind of mentioned it, earlier that you still need to be talking about 501 genes, even though everybody on earth should know about 501 genes. But, so how did you think about, where to put the marketing dollars in a brand like Patagonia?
Yeah, so the biggest gift of a brand like that that's so adored and loved is that there's so much earned media. So that actually saved a lot of marketing dollars that I probably was spending in True Religion when you look at the slicing of the pie of your budget that I didn't have to spend on just top of mind marketing. So a lot of my first 2 years was really about spending money in retention. And then also finding those more nuanced and niche communities. You had, the fandom of people on East Coast and West Coast, where I think we still had a lot of opportunity was to be immersed in the surf community, in the rock climbing community, in the hiking community, in a way that was really meaningful from a digital perspective. The brand had already done that, in real life in a really strong, compelling way. But when it came to digital, when I first started, it was kind of a gloss over. It was kind of like, this is all of Patagonia, and it wasn't Patagonia for climbing, Patagonia for rock, for hiking, et cetera, et cetera. So I spent more money there, and then we would kind of pulse acquisition, so there was a seasonality to it. I have found sort of in my D2C experience of that before you get to holiday, spend a lot of that money, acquisition money, before the prices go up, right? Start getting people in the funnel, which now do we have a funnel? That's very debatable, but at least then, starting to get people into summer, fall. So then when you got to holiday, you kind of were able to retarget people as opposed to just trying to spend acquisition and competing, again, D2C. Patagonia has a huge wholesale market. I'm not going to compete with REI's marketing dollars. I can't compete with, Dick's Sporting Goods marketing dollars in those peak time frames. So we actually would spend our time and energy, more on just kind of getting back to people in a more connected way. And then also, finding ourselves in different channels. Like Reddit turned out to be an amazing channel for Patagonia. And again, I think it's because there was already a fan base there, legitimate communities talking about the brand and what they love about it. So when we showed up in those spaces, it felt very natural.
In the case of Reddit, did it turn into a performance marketing opportunity?
A little bit, yeah, it did. Yeah, you kind of have to pulse it. You can't go too crazy because you'll be kicked out of the club, of course. But one, I was on it a lot just to learn what people were talking about, and some simple things I learned was, for some people, Patagonia wasn't a considered purchase. And I would say on our campus, we didn't really think about the brand that way. We knew we were expensive. We knew we weren't an inexpensive brand, but to see people say, I've been researching and I'm finally buying my first Patagonia gear, it's been a year, that's a considered purchase. That's how long it takes you to find a couch, right? Like, so to know that changes my language on how I market and connect with people, changes how I think about that first acquisition and what that retention and customer journey could really be. And so then we would do things like we sponsor Ask Me Anythings with, professional climbers or people, some of our ambassadors and things like that. Like that was a very great way to show up in a channel like Reddit. And then we would do some direct marketing as well.
Very interesting. How does Angela Clark, if she does, use AI today?
Me and Claude are like besties. So yes, I use Claude a lot. Right now, I probably use it quite a bit for research. When I was at Patagonia, I just left in January. It was Copilot. That was our company approved, tool that we could utilize. I finagled myself into the pilot of that program. It wasn't available to everyone, and I just like, those relationships paid off. So I was an early adopter in the brand, and I really used it a lot of times, sometimes for communication, because I'm not the best speller, and like you have all these thoughts, and kind of helped me sort of think about what I was saying in a more concise way or trying to communicate. But what I used it for a lot of time was just thought partner on how do I develop something, like we were looking at an application, and a lot of the research on, what that model would look like from a kickoff to growth perspective. Me and Copilot were spending hours and hours sort of working through that. My mentor, something I was aspiring to do, is she actually used it to build like customer models and sort of like test product ideas with and get input from them. I hadn't gotten that far, but I am sort of building my sort of assistant team now through AI right now, because I'm trying to manage LinkedIn more and all these other things that I'm doing, my board seats. And, when you're in a portfolio role, some people say you actually end up working more hours because you kind of have your fingers in a lot of different pots. And so I'm trying to set up an infrastructure where that's managed a little bit more easily for me. from calendaring to, replying to people and things of that nature. But a lot of market research for me. I'm thinking of maybe launching my own brand in a small way, and so we've been doing a lot of market research with Claude and Perplexity mainly.
Very cool. I'm a Claude guy as well. I have a lot of friends who make fun of me because of how close I am to Claude. But let's talk just quickly as we get close to the end of the show here about Eclipse Advisory Group and your founding of it. What does the group do?
So we work with mid-tier companies and probably late-stage startups, mid-tier companies, if they're looking for advice on marketing, sort of what my expertise has been, digital, absolutely, direct marketing, and scaling brands, and even profitability. How if you've been at the space, you're trying to figure out how to continue to scale profitability and the brand at the same time. That's really what we specialize in.
Is there a particular challenge that you've seen as you've talked to companies, they come to you for a host of different things, but is there one thread that you would say they all seem to be challenged with?
I think one of the biggest challenges a lot of companies are seeing today is it goes back to sort of the talent pool. So you invest in people, you've got these great talents. Everything's changing. Everything's changing so rapidly now. And if you were to adopt a new tool, a new system, let's say AI in particular, you want people to work differently. You buy the tool, you kind of train people, and then people go back to their old habits, right? And so that sort of transitional and change and organizational change structure is part that I think a lot of brands are struggling with. And when you're looking for every dollar that you can save within your organization, that's just wasted space and time and energy. So I find that I'm often talking about we've decided to make this change. How do I get the rest of the organization on board so that we're moving in the direction that we've invested a year, 6 months to implement this thing? And now we're not getting what we want out of it because there's not the adoption that we're expecting to get. And part of that is one, understanding, did you do it right? Did you implement everything that you need to do? Sometimes you stand something up and all the pieces aren't talking to each other. Is it as useful as you expected? And if it is, then how do we get people to change their behavior and adapt to that so that they can see the benefits of that and move forward? Which means there's puzzle pieces to it, right? It might mean I'm going to shift over here, but that means somebody else is going to have to do this, or this is going to change, or we're just saying that's not important anymore. But having all those conversations and having those sessions to kind of work through all of that, I think a lot of people skip over, and then it kind of it bites them in the end. They really need to do that work in order for it to be efficient and move forward.
Well, good luck with that. Hope it goes well and you can help all of these brands that you're working with. All right, we're down to the last part of the show. We do a 2-minute drill, 7 questions, 1-word answer. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay, a brand that you admire or that inspires you.
I would say I'm inspired by Iris Van Herpen. I'm hoping I'm saying her last name right. She's a designer slash brand. I know it's with 1-word answers. Okay, so I'll just tell you that. Google her. She's amazing.
No, nobody ever sticks to one word, trust me. Favorite app on your phone?
It's probably gonna have to be Instagram. I hate to say it, but it's true.
Last website other than Amazon that you shopped from?
Petco.
Something that you're not good at but wish that you were?
Spelling.
Well, the good news is you've got Claude to help you now.
Yes, I've got a lot of tools.
Charitable organization that you're passionate about?
I am passionate about actually the organization I'm on the board for, California Parks Foundation. They raise money and help support the park system in the state of California. And I think public access to nature is something that's deeply rooted in my Michigan roots.
If you had one superpower, what would it be?
I would say if I could have the superpower, I could push a button and have everybody learn forgiveness and gratitude. That would be my superpower.
Okay, not one that I've heard, but that's a good one. I like that. Other than family, what's your most prized possession?
My grandmother's necklace. I got married last year and I designed my whole wedding around that necklace.
Very nice. Congratulations. Where can people reach out to you, Angela, if they'd like to on social media?
Yeah, the easiest is on LinkedIn. I'm on there posting all the time, easy access there. I also have a website for Eclipse Advisory Group. You can connect with me there as well.
Okay, that's great. Hey, this was fun. Really good conversation. Thanks for making the time, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you so much. This was awesome.
That's it. Today's game ball goes to Angela Clark for coming on the Marketing Playbook. To me, today's 3 game winning marketing plays were as follows. Number 1, if you're the digital person inside a wholesale led business, you already know the feeling Angela described: not getting invited to the product meetings, fighting for a seat at the table. Her answer wasn't to wait for permission. She invited herself in, kept showing up, and over time the organization came around when they saw the impact. If that's your situation, that's the playbook. And number 2, storytelling isn't soft. Angela's point about Levi Strauss still rings true. The internal team was sick of talking about the 501, but the customer never was. Your job as a marketer is to know the difference between what you're tired of saying and what the customer still needs to hear. Those are 2 very different things. And number 3, buying a tool isn't the same as changing behavior. Angela is seeing this across every company she advises right now. Organizations invest in AI, new platforms, new systems, and then 6 months later, they wonder why nothing changed. The tech's only half the work. The other half is the unglamorous job of getting people to actually use it differently. Don't skip that part. Thank you, Playbook marketers, for listening to another episode. If you want to check out more pages of the Marketing Playbook, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast spot and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Until next time, the devil is in the details.